Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen and professors, yes. Could we begin, please? All right. This is the program on constitutional government, and our speaker today is Irwin Stelzer. Irwin Stelzer is a senior fellow and director of Economic Policy Studies Group at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. And before that, he was a resident scholar and director of regulatory policy at studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And he's a columnist, besides being an economist. He's a columnist for the Sunday Times and an editor, contributing editor to the Weekly Standard, where his articles have appeared frequently, especially in this election season. He's a member of the advisory board of American Antitrust Institute, a member of the visiting committee of the Harris School of Public Policy Studies at the University of Chicago. He's an economist who was a businessman, had a business which he founded, the National Economic Research Associates, in 1961, of which he was president until he sold it in 1983. He's been managing director of an investment banking firm of Rothschild, and he's been at Harvard. He was director of the Energy and Environmental Policy Center at Harvard, and he's been a member of the board of the Regulatory Policy Institute at Oxford and an advisor to the U.S. Trade Representative there. So he knows both Washington and London, and even Cambridge, Mass. Yes. He's an economist, skeptical, I would say, of theories and models. He's full of political savvy, which is not. Yeah, that good? That's good. Oh. It's very, very strange for an economist, and we're delighted to have him here. His subject today is neo-orthodoxy, how to adapt the old verities to the way we live now.
Well,
Mr. Stelzer.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Is the mic okay? And thank you all for coming. I always knew there was no free lunch, and I found out today that that's true. Let me sort of set the framework. First of all, abandon hope of nuance, all ye who enter here. I've got 30 minutes. I'm going to paint with a broad stroke, with a broad brush, and only in blacks and white. We can then, in the discussion, make some of these stimulating statements, I hope, a little more nuanced. I would like to distinguish today between what I'll call vulgar policy analysis, between that and proposals that are grounded in the teachings of the great economists, Adam Smith, Maynard Keynes, Joseph Schumpeter, Milton Friedman, and others. To do that, I thought the best way to do that was to pick several controversial areas of economic policy and persuade you that a kind of neo-orthodoxy that is leaning on these great teachings but adapting them to the circumstances in which we find ourselves will enable you to separate as you go through life, because I understand there are no economists in the room, or very few, which is an advantage for me because you won't know when I'm wrong, how to separate sense from nonsense when you hear policy discussion. And I've tried to pick areas in which nonsense is the tool of choice for politicians, both left and right, and see where we go. So let me start with energy policy, because that's been much discussed, and I do that with some trepidation, since the gentleman to my right is an expert or was an expert in that area. Well, in any event, look, two very different policies are on offer. Now, let's start by disregarding all of the above, which both of them say. All of the above is a way of saying I don't know how to make choices, and it's not even coherent enough to be a bumper sticker. So let's ignore all of the above. Broadly, the president wants to subsidize green energy, wind, solar, and all that stuff, and discourage, if not outlaw, the use of fossil fuels. He wants to prevent new coal-fired plants from being built, limit the production of oil and gas, and prevent importation from Canada because they produce oil in a rather messy, environmentally messy way. Mitt Romney sees things differently. He's not quite a member of the baby drill crowd that you may have seen Larry Kudlow leading cheers for, but he would eliminate most of those subsidies for wind and solar. He'd revive the coal industry by relaxing regulations, and he'd authorize importation of oil from Canada. So we have, at least in this area, a coherent, understandable, describable difference. And both, of course, say that their approach will promise millions of jobs. I've never understood the relationship of any of these things to creating jobs, because the best way to create jobs is to have the least efficient production process possible. Indian agriculture creates millions of jobs. They're also starving. So it doesn't seem to me that should be a goal of policy. It should be the result of sensible policy. In any event, let's look at the results of these kinds of approaches and see what we can draw on from our great economists to help us pick our way through this. The result of the president's program is essentially to funnel taxpayer money to various projects that the Secretary of Energy thinks will be winners, Solyndra, battery manufacturers that go bankrupt, and so on. And the reason for that is not that he's stupid. It's that he has no skin in the game. He's playing with other people's money. The problem also is that there is inherent corruption in this process because you're dealing with people who want political favors, and we saw that writ large in Solyndra. I'll talk about redistribution later, because that's also another lovely topic. But keep in mind that subsidies of this sort redistribute money from people with lower incomes to people with higher incomes. The people who get subsidized, for example, there's an electric vehicle that's being made in California, and you get a $7,500 tax credit if you buy this vehicle. The average income of the people getting the credit is $150,000 a year. So that you have subsidies which move, if you believe in anything like distributional justice, and I'll get to that because I don't know what it is, but I'll get to it anyhow. If you have anything like that on your mind, subsidies, you can believe that the people who got the Solyndra subsidies and so on are not among the poorest in the country. They are among very, very rich investors. So let's concede for the purpose of argument that fossil fuels threaten climate change. Now, climate change is an interesting phrase. It used to be called global warming, but the environmentalists are hedging against the new ice age. So they can have it either way. When climate changes, it's due to the things they don't like. Whether it gets hot or cold, it doesn't matter. Rains, doesn't rain. The fact, if there is climate change, and I'm an agnostic. I don't know whether there is because I'm not skilled enough to appraise the scientific evidence. I worry that there might be, so therefore I'm willing to take certain prudential steps. But to find the right policy, the policy that might inform us, it seems to me we can look at a rule laid down long ago by Adam Smith, but even by his predecessors, which is to let prices decide how much of each product gets produced and consumed. And here's where the neo-orthodoxy comes in. Adam Smith didn't know about climate change. And I think was aware of, but not particularly sensitive to, certain environmental problems in places like Manchester, where the rivers were running red, not with blood, but with dye from cotton mills. So to adapt the notion that prices should determine the distribution of this stuff, we should price out all the externalities, all the costs of consumption and production that are not reflected in the price. I assume some of you, not everybody uses bikes here, do they? There must be people who have cars. Yes, well, it's appropriate to your age group. I have cars, and actually large SUVs, several, and so there are externalities when I drive around. I'm polluting the air, and I should have to pay for that in the price of the gasoline I consume. Similarly, windmills have externalities. They kill birds, lots of them, and they interfere with radar operations, and they are ugly. So they have externalities. And the question to take the price system as Adam Smith understood it, and as great economists in the past understood it, we have to adapt it by costing out the externalities and including them in the price of the products. Now, the way to do that with fossil fuels is really rather simple. You have a carbon tax. This is not get me awards at the American Enterprise Institute, but the fact of the matter is we need a carbon tax. And that I am rather hopeful that when they start scrounging around for money after the election, if they indeed decide to try to attack the deficit, that will come back on the agenda. Then let people consume whatever they want, so long as they're paying the full costs of what they do. Okay, so that now you know everything you have to know about energy policy. Now let's get to income distribution, another issue. Mr. Romney is apparently unaware. He's against it. He's apparently unaware that we have a progressive tax system in a welfare state in which we are already redistributing enormous amounts of income, but not enough to satisfy the president, who wants more of it in pursuit of some notion of fairness, which I'll discuss in a minute. For example, when they asked the president, would you raise capital gains taxes if it reduced the revenue going to the Treasury, he said yes. So for him, taxes are not simply revenue raisers. They do something else. They accomplish fairness. So in this brawl, let's call it, over whether we should have further redistribution or not, if Romney had consulted his clearly dog-eared copy of The Wealth of Nations, he would have read that the subjects of every state ought to contribute to the support of government in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state. In other words, a progressive tax system. Very orthodox. But that's not for the president, at least not enough, because he is after something more than distribution related to the benefits you get from living in the state. He is after fairness, and to him that means the rich should pay more. Now, the rich are variously defined. I was interested because I know that, I like to look at data sometime to find that the millionaires and billionaires are people who make more than $200,000 a year. And that's true in California now, where Jerry Brown is on a kick to raise taxes on the wealthy, $200,000 and up, to support education, which means the teachers union in California. Now, there's an interesting book. It's quite old. Most of the books I read now are quite old. By John Selden, called Table Talk. I'm sure many of you know it. And he was discussing fairness or equity. And he said, if I may permit a quote, equity, which means fairness to him, is a roguish thing. For law we have a measure. We know what to trust to. Equity is according to the conscience of the chancellor. 'Tis as if they should make the standard for the measure we call a foot, a chancellor's foot. What an uncertain measure that would be. One chancellor has a long foot, another has a short foot, a third chancellor has an indifferent foot. 'Tis the same thing as relying on the chancellor's conscience. And I think that describes how elusive this concept of fairness is. Now, I say that with some trepidation because there are people here who know a lot more about philosophy and all that stuff than I do. But I would resort to three neo-orthodox guides to get me through this which is essentially a brawl in which Romney is looking for an incentive-based tax system, and the president is looking for a fairness-based tax system. First, I would rely on Adam Smith saying I want a progressive income tax system, unspecified, unquantified. Second, I think we're better served by seeking a tax system that provides incentives to accomplish the things we want done. If you want fewer emissions, there should be taxes on emissions. If you want more housing for poor people, there should be subsidies for housing for poor people. But you use the tax system to achieve stated goals, and you relate the specific features of the tax system like we do for charitable contributions now. But remember, once you put that in, you never get it out. I mean, it's there forever, or very, very hard to change. And what we want to do is, if you think of Keynes and Schumpeter, those two economists, Keynes said that progress and growth rely on the animal spirits of investors. And you don't want a tax system that stifles the animal spirits of investors. And Schumpeter talked about the creative destruction that we need entrepreneurs to create new products to move us forward in our living standards so that we can destroy old, inefficient systems. And the third is that we do have to consider fairness. I mean, Adam Smith has long passages on the dangers of wildly unequal income distribution systems. And I won't read them to you, but I refer you to page 612 in my edition of The Wealth of Nations, which is the two-volume, the wonderful edition. Now, the question is, what do you do about it? Well, it seems to me the first thing you do is, before you start redistributing, get the distribution right so you have less to redistribute. And the problem is that the corporate governance system in this country is broken. In 1932, Adolf Berle and Gardner Means wrote a wonderful book explaining that diversified, largely small shareholders can't control the actions of the managers of their businesses. This is called the principal agent problem. The agent was not doing what's in the interest of the principal. He was buying corporate jets. One guy I was involved in with a takeover had a 20,000 rare bottle wine collection, which he thought, after these predators I was working with, that's what they were called. We were all Jewish at the time, so it unleashed a wave of anti-Semitism on Wall Street when Mike Milken and Saul Steinberg and all these people and me. He thought that when we took over his company, we walked in and I'll never forget this. He said to the lawyer I was sitting with, "If you Jews think you can come in here with your cigars and Diet Cokes and take away my company, you're wrong." Well, then we had to take away his company. There was no way we could leave him with his company. And he thought he would get to keep the wine collection, which ordinarily, as a courtesy, we probably would have done, but no dice. We took it. Now, the interesting thing about that is it was a combination of the self-correcting characteristics of capitalism, where Mike Milken came along. He discovered a way to finance these takeovers using markets plus regulation, which made it more difficult for these people to have boards of directors that serve them rather than the shareholders. So there's a structural flaw in corporate governance, and Sarbanes-Oxley fixed some of it. Dodd-Frank will fix some more of it. But if we can get the income distribution system right, so that we can morally say people are getting what economists call their marginal revenue product, or you would call their value. I leave aside ball players because that's a whole other story, and I'll be glad to talk about it separately. Then the redistribution problem becomes less because there is a moral underpinning for the initial distribution. Now, who's going to do that? I don't, I mean, that's a hard slog. Okay, just to make sure that there are other people here I haven't antagonized yet, let's talk about student finances. I thought that would be an interesting thing. I find it ludicrous that we subsidize student loans. Now, perhaps I'm prejudiced by the fact that I worked my way through, the usual Lower East Side story. I worked my way through undergraduate school. I worked my way through graduate school. I delivered laundry. I sold stuff. I had a book. Leave that aside, because that's personal prejudice, which I always feel trumps everything else anyhow. Ask instead whether a university education, or at least an education of the sort on offer now, in many of the fields being taught, is a public good anymore. I leave that question to higher authority. Is it worthy of subsidy by taxpayers with average incomes that will be below those that the students will eventually earn? Do you want the direction of that subsidy to buy that good? Now, again, Adam Smith had an answer. He looked around at university teachers, and he said that teachers exert an effort in proportion to the necessity they are under of making that exertion. Now, that says something about tenure, and it says something about what the real problem of students is. It's not that they have to borrow money and pay it back. They'll earn, you wouldn't buy a house with cash, so you shouldn't buy the asset of your education with cash. The problem is that they are buying a service from probably the least efficient service provider that anyone could imagine, staffed by people who can't be fired, who self-select their successors and colleagues, who turn some of them into administrators who couldn't administer a two-car funeral, and wonder why education costs so much. Bizarre. And to the extent that you finance students to enable them to buy this shoddy product, this inefficient shoddy, excuse me, not in all places, of course. Some that are worth far more than what you're paying for them. Okay, let me just hit a few more topics. Can I have time for a few more? Yes. Some people may not yet be angry. Competition policy. There are usually great divergence between the parties in competition policy. When George W. Bush was elected, he essentially eviscerated the antitrust laws. When Democrats are elected, they have trouble finding a successful company that they really like. They think big is bad, successful is not really very good. The government could probably do it better. So you have a clear divergence of views on that. And again, let me tell you what the teachings are on this. Teaching is competition is good. It forces people to offer better and better products at lower and lower prices. You can see that now in tablets, if nothing else. To pick a thing that probably students are familiar with. Prices keep coming down, then a new one comes out that's more, and within 6 weeks. The interesting thing is in the literature now, we used to think of newspapers as the old media. They're now talking about Google, Microsoft, and Facebook being the old media because of the emergence of cell phones, of non-stationary devices. But in any event, there's two aspects to competition policy in which we have guidance. The economists are clear. Competition is a good thing. They are also clear that where you can't have competition, you must have regulation. That's what upsets the right very often. Hayek, Irving Kristol will tell you over and over again that private monopoly power will be abused, and if you must have monopoly power of some sort, you have to regulate it with the government. Now, I know all the problems of regulation. I've worked that street for 50 years. I even got asked by Ed Koch when he was mayor to help come up with a new schedule of prices for taxi cabs, which is the only time I have been visited by very threatening people from Staten Island who described to me the needs of their constituency. I tried one modest reform. I suggested that you allow people to double up in taxi cabs going from a hotel to LaGuardia Airport. The mayor called me in about a week later and said, "Are you out of your mind?" I said, "What's wrong?" He said, do you realize I'm getting complaints about this? The doormen are not getting as many tips because they're putting more people in a single cab. I said, how many doormen can there be in New York City that you should be worried about it? Enough, he said. So, anyhow, that's regulation, but still, it does work better than private monopoly power. The other aspect is that competition is, if you keep open competition, you keep open new entry, you keep open social mobility, you keep open two guys in a garage. They must have a lot of garages in Stanford, but two guys in a Stanford garage who can create valuable products and become rich. So there's a social aspect to this too, again, widely recognized in the literature. So I won't dwell on that much longer, but I can if you want to get questions. I wanted to end with one other point. I'll skip all this stuff about competition and about regulation. Keep in mind one thing about regulation, especially since campuses tend to be more liberal, and they tend to see regulation through rather rosy glasses. And remember, Ronald Reagan said that the liberal credo is if it moves, tax it; if it keeps moving, regulate it; and if it stops moving, subsidize it. Regulation should be done with care. It should eliminate monopoly power. It should correct market imperfections if you can't do it with tax policy. I'll leave it at that. I want to just conclude, and I'm nervous. I'm watching the clock because I remember Bill Clinton. Remember Bill Clinton?
Yes.
In that long Dukakis introduction where he said, in conclusion, and everybody cheered. Let me just conclude. I'll run a little over the half hour. Let me conclude with distinguishing between the vulgar critique of capitalism and a legitimate critique of capitalism and what we have to learn from economists. I'll summarize the vulgar critique, which I derive from reading 5 books recently published, many of them from here. First, capitalism ignores the most important things in life. As John Kenneth Galbraith pointed out long ago, big business uses advertising to get people to buy stuff that they don't really want, or that he felt they shouldn't want. He didn't make that quite clear. They do that in pursuit of profits. The cost of that is that people keep running like gerbils on a treadmill to acquire more and more stuff. One of the new books, not from here, we should be seeking more leisure rather than more stuff. This comes from a member of the House of Lords in London, and a very good economist, by the way, Mr. Skidelsky, Lord Skidelsky. The idea that everything has a price is morally reprehensible. That is a product of your faculty. And 2 examples that leap to mind from the book are, it is wrong, I guess is the right word, to pay someone to keep your place in line. And he cites, I believe, lobbyists who hire homeless people to stand on line for them so they can get a seat at hearings. So I thought about this a minute. Now, there's this homeless guy, and they're paying him $20 an hour. Yeah, that's terrible. And instead, they could be standing on line and billing their client $500 an hour, which would then get into consumer prices. So I had trouble wrestling, but I'm more limited an economist than broader gauge people, what the moral problem was here. Also, there was a feeling that it is wrong to sell organs. Now, I tried to figure that one out too. First of all, if you don't pay someone for them, you aren't going to get a lot of them. And second of all, a Turkish peasant who sells a, whatever one you can spare, I'm not good at this stuff. Kidney, good, kidney is good. Sells a kidney for $35,000 to a rich Arab whom I hate. What's wrong with that? The Turkish guy now can keep his family in better style. Unfortunately, the Arab guy goes away healthy. I have trouble finding what the alternative is. The alternative is this system we now have of allocating them by region, by a bureaucracy that's just terrible. The other part of the criticism is that the Chinese model has proved itself superior because their recession is a growth rate of 7.5%, and our recession is a growth rate, negative growth rate or very low growth rate. So I thought about all of these criticisms of capitalism, and it is clear that if you look at the literature, there is a mounting disenchantment with democratic free market capitalism. Partly, I think, because of the financial upheaval we had, partly because the system proved to be terribly flawed, especially in the financial sector, and partly because the increasing inequality of income distribution has people upset. Although I don't know if you saw the New York Times this morning about the billionaire premier of China, whose 90-year-old mother is a really shrewd investor. She's worth hundreds of millions, investing in state-owned companies. So they have an inequality problem too. There is at every stage of economic development an economic problem. The defense seems to me to be that the history of capitalism, which is that combinations of legislation and self-healing seem to work. That is, when we get problems, environmental problems from Pittsburgh to Victorian Manchester, that combination seems to work. When workplaces became terribly unsafe, we got a combination of legislation and competition for good workers that produced safer workplaces. In my judgment, we overdid it, but it's not so terrible when you get out of the East Coast, because in the West, where I spend a lot of time, they just ignore it. So you get a nice balance of what's sensible and what's cost effective. In our country, when robber barons began to extort users of railroads and other things, we got a combination of new railroad lines to compete and of regulation to prevent that. So it is and most important, I think, when corporate America got fat and sloppy, we had Mike Milken and the wave of hostile takeovers that converted these, that got the incentives back in line, because when you borrow a lot of money to buy a company, you have to work really hard to get that company efficient so you can pay the debt back. It strikes me that a lot of this complaint about capitalism is a complaint by anti-market intellectuals. That is, they find the flaws, but they're really against market distribution of income. A lot of them academics who really know they're worth more than a hedge fund manager and can't figure out why the market doesn't recognize that. So it must have some imperfection that they have not yet discovered. As for China, I think people who tell me you can't breathe in Beijing, and people in jail for dissent, and the workers now who are trying desperately to get their domestic living standards up because a manipulated currency that keeps the value of that currency low is disadvantaging them terribly. I think that let's see. In conclusion, I want a cheery note. In 1835, Tocqueville wrote, and I have the really good translation, the great privilege of the Americans is not only to be more enlightened than others, but to have the ability to make repairable mistakes. And I think in democratic free market capitalism, the mistakes have generally proved to be repairable. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Harvey, question?
Two questions. One, that quote that you gave from Smith about progressive taxation, not familiar with it, went by me too quickly because I was just hearing it. But it wasn't clear that, as I recall it, that it meant progressive taxation, because if you had a flat rate tax, those who are indeed earning more
Right.
would pay more. So
Right.
I wondered whether the quote really said progressive taxation. That was
Yes.
the first question. The second question, you talked about monopolies, private monopolies as opposed to government.
Private monopoly power, right.
And I would like to know if there is such a case that you know of, certainly not taxi cabs in New York, which require a medallion.
Right.
And therefore
That's government
it's a
regulation.
Government-regulated
Right.
industry.
Well, the second question, see, just think of high voltage transmission lines. Or think of gas distribution systems under the street. You're not going to dig up the street to have a competing gas distribution system. Now, these so-called natural monopolies, there are far fewer of them than we used to think. I mean, if you look at the literature, we used to think a lot of things were natural monopolies that it turns out aren't. And we have Alfred Kahn to thank for that. He deregulated the airlines. He pushed very hard for deregulation. And so our definition of natural monopolies has changed. Our conception of it has changed, but there still are some. And if you either have to regulate them or trust that you will not get grabbing. As for the Smith quote, I stretched it. I believe that's what it must have meant, but it can easily be interpreted the way you interpret it. So if I had more time.
Our great free market author, and you distorted it to
No, I didn't distort it. I interpreted it. There's a very big difference. The point, I think the point though remains. If you had a flat rate tax, let's say what is he talking about? He's cutting. Oh no, his is different. Okay, let's assume you had a flat percentage tax, right? I think that would probably fit Smith's definition, but it would also. I mean, it would be hard to argue that that's not progressive. But I can see you can put your interpretation on it as easily as mine.
You're the one who got the 20,000 bottles of rare wines.
No, I didn't actually. You know, when people buy something, they get to keep it. I was just a consultant. So.
I thought that was a great talk, so thank you very much.
Right, you're very perceptive. Thank you.
And I'll take you up on your suggestion that we kind of push for some of the difficulties and subtleties. So, and I have actually 4 elements I'd like to get your reaction to. One is on the carbon tax. I teach a section of a course on this, and I give the students, give them the argument for command and control regulation, and for cap and trade, and for carbon tax.
Right.
And I think I don't try to push them too much in one way or direction, but they all come out of the thing with the carbon tax.
Right.
When you're looking at this, I think in the abstract it seems good. And I point out there's one problem with this, which is that there's one thing the American public hates, and one thing that the politicians won't touch, it's a tax on gasoline.
Right.
So there's one problem. That's why politicians tend to look for these more indirect. And think of Charles Schultz's claim: first rule of American politics: do no visible harm.
Right.
And that's a visible
Right.
harm.
Right. The question is, in an era in which we're scrambling for money, and since the carbon tax might be the lesser of the evils, is it back on the agenda? Cap and trade, which for those of you who don't know is you issue permits and then they let people trade them. I don't have a really firm distinction between them, but I watched as we started to talk about cap and trade, and the process was so corrupt because I would be for auctioning off permits, but that's not what happened. They started to give them away. And so the people with the best representation on K Street got essentially printing money. I mean, if you're giving people permits that they can sell, you might as well give them money. This was a very corrupt process. Well, I don't want to name the companies, but so that led me to carbon tax. Is it likely? Probably not. But I would sort of like to keep on the table the notion that you should tax bad things, not good things. Work is a good thing. risk-taking is a good thing. It has real benefits to society. Emissions are not such a good thing. They're bad things. So, you know, I don't know. I'm not enough of a politician to know if it has any future, but it seems to me at least we ought to know where we want to go. And again, that's a distinction between, you know, people in think tanks and in the academy and politicians. You at least ought to sort of make them feel bad when they don't go in the right direction. I'm sorry, you had three more.
No, actually, I'll do one more. I don't want to, which is market failures in education. I often think of the line, education is the one thing people buy that they want less of. So that they really don't know.
Tell me about that.
What I mean that they actually they want their certificate.
Yeah,
they want the credential, but they don't necessarily want an education.
Right.
So, I mean, so the question I would have, how well do markets work when you're really looking for an education rather than for the credential?
Well, what is an education as opposed to the credential? How are they distinct? I mean, you don't go to class and you just, you know, they have diploma mills, right?
Or you go to an institution that has rampant grade inflation, for example. Not to mention any
right, or any subject that might get me killed on my left here. First of all, employers know that. I mean, if you think you can go to some place that has a giant football team and one tenured professor and come to me and try to get a job, you're wrong. So I think it's very hard to take that credential and go in the market. Now, it's increasingly hard to take credentials from places that don't even have football teams. But you notice, for instance, they had a session about this in Silicon Valley last week, and they were all quoting Steve Jobs, and a lot of the venture capital people there and so on said they want liberal arts graduates because they want there's nothing I mean, I don't know about the higher sciences, but they want people who can think originally and fast and are trained to think. So I don't know what the credential would be. I haven't hired for a long time, but I don't think you can fool the market with it. So if you're buying a credential, you better be pretty sure that you're going to use it in an uninformed market.
Yeah, I'm following up on Shep's question. So my father was also, I don't know what your university was, but you referred to the Lower East Side. My father also Lower East Side, a very proud graduate of City College.
Right.
Class of 39, I think. Worked 3 jobs and
Yeah,
as many.
the whole story, right.
The whole story. I had a professor in college with an Oxbridge accent, a logician, very famous logician, and I remember seeing his name in my father's City College yearbook.
Right.
And, which was a bit of a surprise. And I went up to him after class, and I asked him why he spoke that way. And his reply was pure affectation, my dear. So I've always been very impressed by a City College education. But the fact is that it was taxpayer subsidized.
Right.
I understand. So I just would like you getting at the nuances, to explore a little bit more what you would do about education, which is in something of a state of crisis, but where some sort of free market, Phoenix University style, online solutions may not be really either. So I just wanted to.
Well, first of all of these policies have to be thought about in the context that exists. The context that existed in New York City when City College was the great institution it was doesn't exist anymore. The people who are getting free education now at City College are not the people who got free education when you or most of my friends' parents or a lot of my friends got free education. So you can't abstract from the context in which you find yourself. The comments I made about education were designed partly to offset the slumbering feeling that overcomes one after lunch. The fact is that education is, in measure still, a public good. The problem is it is decreasingly serving the purpose of a public good, and I don't know how to sort it out. We do know, I just I was at a visiting committee meeting in Chicago, and fortunately I had dinner with the guy who settled the strike of the teachers union in Chicago. And on the other side of me was a guy who is financing charter schools in Chicago. Now, it became absolutely clear in 20 minutes that the system of private funding of charter schools, if we could get vouchers, would be superior to all of the reforms this guy has in mind for this enormous, dysfunctional education system in Chicago. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that I think whatever it is to fund, to give subsidized loans to people to get higher education that will inevitably increase their income to above the average level of the people who are funding them, has something wrong with it. Now, if you tell me they're all going to become missionaries in Mississippi or Uganda or whatever, I would be inclined to reevaluate that. But, I mean, you make a student loan to someone who's going to work for Goldman Sachs? I mean, what is that all about? So I must confess, I don't have an answer to your question, but I do think on the city college thing, you want to think about policies that are appropriate in one context may not be appropriate in another. And if I go any further, I'm going to be in real trouble. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about your read on the two parties, I guess the two presidential candidates. I remember when I was in high school in Canada, the woman, Kim Campbell, running for prime minister, said in a press conference during the election that an election is no time to answer serious questions. That's not a good time for that. And I think she was asked about healthcare reform, and she didn't want to talk about it, and she just said what she must have been thinking. Well, we can't really tell you what we think now, because we're trying to get elected. And I have a trouble, and she lost, by the way, the Tories lost mostly because of that, as far as I know. And I have trouble sort of understanding your critique of Romney in this slide. I want to ask about Obama as well. I don't know for sure, because of Mormon, your backgrounds are somewhat different, but it's hard for me to be sure that anything you said about the economy and markets would be something he would disagree with. And so,
Romney.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, he knows most of this. I mean, you may have congressional disagreements on certain points, but so whatever he's selling now seems to be just things he needs to sell. He's got a big base, lots of crazy Tea Party people. So anyway, so there's Romney. So it's hard for me to see what your substantive critique of his true position is. But on the Obama side, I don't know what to say. That's for me a big black box. Harvey Mansfield wrote in the Weekly Standard that he sees austerity coming, and so he's both the cause and suffering from malaise, and he sees austerity coming. And I'm not as sure. I feel like actually maybe he's hopeful that the economy is just so strong and America is just so powerful that we'll just get back on track and he won't have to make, the Democratic Party won't have to make decisions. Where do you see the nonsense versus the
Well, first of all, my critique of Romney would be that he is unwilling to attack or it doesn't even think. Look, these people don't make mistakes. They blurt out the truth sometimes. That's called a gaffe. And Romney doesn't even, I mean, when he said the 47% thing, which was considered a gaffe, it wasn't a gaffe. That's how he thinks. Now, when he had to think it over, first of all, he decided it wasn't a really good idea. And second of all, he probably came to realize if you disaggregate that number that he didn't have it quite right. But when it comes to issues like the structure of the financial services industry, I mean, he wants to repeal Dodd-Frank. I have to tell you, I don't like Dodd-Frank. Probably don't like half of the 10,000 regulations that they're writing. But there's an awful lot of good in Dodd-Frank, including the Vulgar rule, which I'm sure he doesn't like. He wants to repeal Obamacare. Well, first of all, he can't. And second of all, there's good stuff in Obamacare. So, but he's not distinguishing. You're right. I called a senator last week, and right after the last debate, because in it the president said, we will not go over the financial cliff. You remember that? So I figured, oh boy, they must have something in mind. So I called a Democratic senator. He said, oh no, he said it because it's an election. You have to say things like that. I do all the time. So I think, that's fine. I mean, they say that. But the fact is the distinctions, ask yourself this. Did the election process, the campaigning process, enable you to distinguish enough between the candidates so that you can make a reasonably intelligent choice of the one that is more in line with your thinking, not the details of some bill he might write, but did the process, messy, lying, whatever you want to call it, not make clear to you what the differences are? And they're very clear, right? I mean, one would rely more on government, one would rely more on the private sector. One wants to tax the rich, the other wants to preserve incentives for the rich to create. I mean, there's enough broad distinctions so that the campaign was, I think, very revealing and useful. Now, if you worry about it didn't tell you enough about policy in Mali, well, then you're asking too much, I think. So, I mean, do you know the difference between these two guys?
Obama's stated position, a position one could possibly carry through, given the debt and entitlement
Look,
problem? Is it an actual proposal that one could follow through on?
None of these are proposals you can follow through on. The debt.
How is it informative? It's
The
not
debt.
someone proposing.
Oh, because they will do it differently, right? They will do it differently. So what you can guess at is which one of the ways they will do it is more likely to succeed. Now, the fact that the debt is now Grecian, and the deficit is enormous, and it's unlikely that these people will attack it in a serious way, should lead you to the obvious conclusion, which is hold on to all your physical assets, because the way governments solve this problem historically is with inflation. You print enough money, we're doing it now. You print enough money, you distort the markets, and you pay off. I mean, what are the Chinese worried about? We keep talking to them about manipulating their currency. They're sitting on $1 trillion of our IOUs, and we're sitting on a bunch of printing presses about to run off the dollars to pay them back. And they're hoping they have enough baskets to carry it to the store. So, but I mean, is there any doubt in your mind which candidate you prefer after the campaign, after listening to the campaign? I'm not asking you which one.
No, I think I know, but I
Right.
just don't know who, on Obama's side, I just don't know how they can maintain the quote-unquote blue state model. You said inflation.
They can't maintain it. They can't. They can't. It can't be done. It's not possible. I mean, yes, it's possible if he has this amazing conversion on November 6th and said, ha-ha, I don't have to talk to Nancy Pelosi anymore. I'm going to raise some taxes. I'm going to do a grand bargain that he's talking about now. It's obvious to everybody, you have to raise some taxes and you have to cut some spending, and he's not prepared to cut the entitlement spending. But that's because it would not disturb him. If you look at Krugman, for instance, who is kind of the idol of the left people who have never read Keynes properly, you would see that Krugman says this. He would not be offended if the government, if taxes absorbed 50, if the government portion of GDP went to 50%. Now, I had that argument in Britain before when I was doing some things with Tony Blair, and his then Chancellor, Gordon Brown, who was fought to the left of him, had as his target getting government to 50% of GDP, and succeeded, which is why they're now digging themselves out of a hole. So I think the campaign succeeded. You know who you're going to vote for. What more could you ask for? Yes, yes, yes. Okay.
Kind of follow up on that. I mean, these differences that emerge with tolerable clarity from the campaigns. To what extent do you see these key differences as coming down to disagreements about means to an agreed upon end versus disagreement about the end? So, in other words, how much is it really an economic question versus a political question? Do we all, do we all agree that the aim here is to maximize growth, and we have different economic theories about how one goes about it, or is it fundamental principles?
I think it's fundamental principles. I mean, there's differences about means too, but for example, if you are very green and you don't want to maximize growth. That's not what you want to do. I mean, there's a whole history from the Club of Rome about people who, whereas Romney and the Republicans think they can grow their way out of this mess. The Democrats are not particularly in favor of growth. Their emphasis is much more on redistribution. Or a fundamental difference is that Romney would try, I don't know if he'd succeed, but he has a feeling that bigger government, it does bad things. It's inefficient, but also that it creates dependencies, it has moral consequences. Obama doesn't believe that. Obama would grow the government. The scariest report today in the GDP figures that came out today, which were very low, was that one of the things that increased was the government part of GDP. I hope it's only a quarterly blip. So I think there are very fundamental differences. I mean, if you think just about energy, which is easier to focus on, the issue is almost not only do you like oil or do you like windmills. The issue is, what is your vision of what you want the country to look like, to feel like? And I think those are very different. I think if you plumped Romney down in old Pittsburgh with the smokestacks going, he would say this is evidence of vitality. And as I did, actually, before I started to read about this stuff. So I think there's a fundamental difference. I do think that the one thing they agree on is that there's a fundamental difference. Now, they have to agree on that or else their lives would be futile, right? But I think that on that, they're both right.
I mean, I'm partly struck by, I mean, I would agree with that, but I'm partly struck that Republicans don't make more of an argument. Like, they always seem to be on the side of the rich, and they really want the rich to be able to keep as much money as possible, whereas it seems like, you know, if you defend lower taxes just over and over again, but it's about what would help the whole economy grow. It's not that we care about the rich as such, it's that we think that this would be better for everyone, and if it weren't, we wouldn't. I mean, but they don't.
Well, for two reasons. For two reasons. One is they really like the rich.
No.
I mean, they're much more comfortable with them than with the poor. So that's one reason. But the second reason is they don't get it. For example, I'm an economist, okay? And if you repeal the Bush tax cuts on the wealthy, now I would have a definition of wealthy, not a cop working overtime married to a legal secretary in Chicago. But I haven't seen any evidence that raising, for instance, capital gains tax would in any way reduce incentives to work. In fact, I wrote a piece, I should have brought it. I came out for 100% inheritance tax on the grounds that if you won the sperm lottery, that didn't entitle you to anything. And the notion that the tax was on the guy who died is ridiculous. He can't pay the tax. It's on the person who got it for doing nothing except hanging around his parents. Well, it was not a big hit in the circles in which I travel. I have to tell you. I said, one of the smartest guys I know has the most delightful son. I said to him, what did you think of the piece? Waiting for Reason Criticism was loaded with data on the effects of lottery receipts and so on. He said, drop dead. That was his reasoned response to my piece. And George Will attacked it and said that.
Maybe he wanted his son to continue to be delightful.
Yes, that's true, but without working for it.
Yes.
But without working to become delightful. George Will wrote, because he knew this, he said, Irwin's wife advised him not to publish the piece, wise woman. But they are insensitive to that argument, and the argument ought to be in terms of incentives, not in terms of distributive justice. But as I say, they don't get that.
This is the first point at which you've lost me, so I'm sorry to...
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, because that is my only incentive. You're
What?
taking away, leaving the money to my children.
Right.
That's my
Okay.
strongest incentive.
Right.
So
And what would you
don't-
do with it if you couldn't?
What I do with it?
Yeah.
I would try to cheat in every way
Right,
possible
good,
to
okay.
give them the money beforehand.
Well, you're going to do that anyhow, right, to get around inheritance taxes. But, no, well, what would you do with it?
Save because
Right.
I want to leave
Right.
them the biggest amount of money. I don't have
Right.
the
So that
biggest
they don't have to work harder.
No, it's not
The
that.
yes.
No, it's, I mean, we're not talking about your
Yeah,
millionaires
I know.
and billionaires, but I think that is a perennial, it's a very
That-
deep and strong economic and incentive.
But
and
but you see, it reduces
prosperity.
their incentive to work. So we're trading off. What the trade-off is, all the data show that people with inheritances tend to participate less in the workforce. Now, we're talking magnitudes, and I understand that. But all I'm saying is the real criticism.
So would you
I'll
pay
tell you what the real criticism.
$200,000
I'll tell you what the real criticism of what because I got a letter from somebody who really criticized it from your point of view and was right. But you can't criticize it in terms of incentive, because the incentive for you to work, right? If you couldn't, if you would work less and they would have to work more. The one line letter I got from a very dear friend in London, took the article, clipped his letter to it and said, it's against human nature. And that's the criticism. The reason I wrote the piece was because my conservative friends were against affirmative action on the grounds that we should all start equal. I said, oh, you want equal? I'll give you equal. And I wanted to see what argument they would then have against affirmative action if they wanted everybody to start equal. And the arguments weren't very good, actually. But your argument is the best. It's against human nature, and you're right.
I did want to ask on another level, one of the things that is most disturbing about the anti-capitalist ethos is not the argument itself, it's that it is a politics of grievance and blame. And it's extremely worrisome to me. I don't think I've ever seen in the polity this rise to this level. And my major study in life is anti-Semitism, and it's exactly the same thing, a politics of grievance and blame. You just have to change because you have a competitive system which says, you know, competition is the best kind of thing. If you cannot stand inequalities, if you cannot develop a culture that loves inequalities, because inequalities is freedom. Inequalities gives you the freedom to fail. I mean, you have to be able to, I think that what I got from your paper was that one has to find a more effective way of expressing that, of teaching that, of interpreting that, so that people would be able to live with disparities more comfortably, know where these principles come from, know what they gain from it. And I just wanted to add one thing, since I'm from the humanities, it's not only in the contemporary university where this begins. Literature, which I teach, has such an enormous prejudice against capitalism.
Who wrote it?
Right, but when you're talking about neo-orthodoxy, we teach the classics. You teach the classics, and you teach,
Right.
you teach this thing. So in a sense, what you inadvertently very often reinforce, except for some very great writers who were in fact conservative thinkers, if you're teaching modern literature, very often what you're teaching is a literature that reinforces what you have in this politics of grievance and blame.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that the intensity of it is any greater than in the days of our founding fathers, or more recently in Al Gore's presidential campaign. It was the same
The 1%,
policy.
yes.
But I can only give you, your view is broader than mine. I'm an economist. I don't really know much about humanity. So if you could eliminate the sources of inequality that are two things that are very difficult to justify. Let's take acceptance at universities based on the fact that your parents went there, as an example. Random. What we try to do when we eliminate insider trading, what we consider inequality produced by either illegal or unfair or methods that are not related to the contribution of the person who is making all that money. Structural reforms that would correct a situation where a guy wrecks a bank and gets a $50 million bonus to go home. That grates. Those sources of inequality grate, and those are the ones that get widely publicized, and so they feed into this. That's one thing. The other is more chancy, but let me try it out since I assume I have the right to be wrong here. But there might, Gertrude Himmelfarb, who's a very great historian and a very good friend, argues that there's a concept called enough, that there is some point at which it gets obscene, the amount of money. Now, she's beat up on me for 20 years on this subject, and I finally conceded. So I think if you can't fix everything that you want, because there will be politicians who can count, and they know that, it's like Governor Brown, he's got a new tax on the top 1% to fund the schools for everybody. So they can count, you can't fix that. But if you can attack the sources of inequality that are not related to the performance of the person who is, let's call it, doing well, and if you accept some point where you say $100 million, that maybe we should do something about that. Now, that part I'm still wobbly on. But the first part, and that's all I can think of to do. You can't stop bad guys from saying bad things in a free country. And you've got to trust that the American people they've never bought a class warfare argument before. Now, this time they may, because people are in difficulty and because they're uncertain about the future of the country. And I don't know for what other reasons. I think partly there's a predisposition to not want the first African-American president to fail. So all of these things are playing in that may end us up in the situation that you describe. And as for the violence of the language that disturbs you, I think people are smart enough to cut through that. Not everybody, but America. Look, we've been around a long time, and we've never bought that stuff for long. I mean, we had guys like Father Coughlin. I mean, you remember all these people. And it didn't work. I mean, they were roaring anti-Semites. It didn't work. So while I worry about it, I try to figure out what I can do about it. And the only thing I can think of is this trying to put a moral basis under the inequality that exists. I think there was something over here. Okay, one.
I kind of follow up on this question. You mentioned just in a little aside that you don't know who is going to fix the structural problem in corporate governance. That's my concern. You asked, did the campaign leave you decided or not? I'm actually kind of undecided, which is embarrassing to admit around here, precisely because I am worried about this problem of corporate governance and plutocracy. Plutocracy aided and abetted by a kleptocracy in corporate governance. I mean,
it's a worry.
It's a worry, and I don't see that the Republicans are going to do anything about it.
No.
And the Democrats might more so.
Well, here's the problem. There's two things you have to worry about, right? Hyperactive policymaking and inactive policymaking. Okay, so we really have a choice of one or the other in this field.
So and which is worse?
Huh?
So if that's
well,
our choice, which is worse?
Well, if you're undecided, I don't want to presume to know you, but I'll bet there are other things that have you undecided more than corporate governance. Corporate governance, right? So,
Feeding to the larger question.
yeah, I know, right? I know, but I mean, if George Romney said tomorrow, "I am no longer a plutocrat, and I promise I'm going to break up all the big companies," you'd remain undecided. Right, okay, so let's clear that off first, okay? Now, on the question, it's an important question, and it's why I'm unhappy with George Romney. Mitt Romney. Sure. It goes to show my age. That's why I'm unhappy with him, because it's interesting. These two guys want the status quo in two different places. Obama would like to keep the status quo in terms of, let's say, the power of public service unions, right? Which Romney, I'm sure, would like to change if he would only say so. Romney would like to keep, he wants to repeal he's not going to repeal them, but he is not unhappy with the way American corporations work. Which is interesting for a guy who's made his fortune taking over badly functioning ones and fixing them. So he must see it up close. But that's not going to turn him on. So if you're voting for the candidate most likely to disrupt American corporations, your man is Obama. If you want to vote for somebody who's unlikely to be so disruptive that at least the system will keep working recognizably as we know it, then Romney's your man. But don't fuss with it, because it's not what's going to decide you. I'm perfectly happy to say that.
On this issue, I'm undecided.
Oh, good. Well, you see, you can't, but the ballot doesn't say, here are 25 issues. Now, which one, that's not the way it works. So, but you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right to be concerned about that.
I've got a question, but let's have Andy first.
I wanted to ask you about Europe.
Oh, yes.
So you've given us a sense for what may well happen.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I watch it very carefully. I'm heavily involved in a lot of it. What you're seeing is the Angela Merkel is accomplishing what the Wehrmacht couldn't. You will see the whole theory of the European Union was that we should have a European Germany rather than a German Europe, right? The euro was the first time we experimented with a currency union before we had political union. So we don't have fiscal union. The way it's going to play out is perfectly clear. The 17 countries that are in the Eurozone will become increasingly separate from the 10 that are just in the that are just in the EU, but not in the Eurozone. And the interesting thing is that the 10 that are not in the Eurozone but are in the EU are the more liberally economic countries: Great Britain, Poland, Czech Republic, etc. So you will see an increasingly dirigiste Eurozone, increasingly protectionist, with increasing fiscal consolidation, because you can't run monetary policy without fiscal policy, as we've now found out. I mean, the Greeks, well, let's call it the southern tier, just went berserk. Of course, they could borrow money at German rates because lenders thought that there would be backing, and so their banks are all shot and so on. They will hold, there's a huge, I mean, I talked to a lot of people in Germany. They're very angry that they should retire at 65 and the Greeks should retire at 50 and so on. But they're weighted down with history. And the two aspects of history that they're weighted down with is a fear of inflation, which is printing money. So that's why they're very hesitant to let the European Central Bank buy bonds. And they're weighted down with the burden of seeming to have wanted to control Europe by unpleasant means. they will cough up the money. But the trade-off will be that fiscal and tax policy determination will pass to Frankfurt and Berlin, although the edicts will come out of Brussels. France is no longer in a position to constrain German policy because France, in my judgment, is going to be next on the list. I mean, they have a really big budget problem. It's not as big, but it's more enduring and more entrenched. So that they're no longer in a position to bargain as equals. France needed Germany so that it could seem it had power, and Germany needed France so that it could seem it didn't. and that bargain is over. So I think you will see an increasing fiscal consolidation of the Eurozone. Greece will be kept in, although it should get out, in its own interest, not in the Eurozone's interest. It should get out and inflate the hell out of the economy and just get rid of this. This is, in a sense, a class war that's going on. This is a war that we used to talk about when I was an undergraduate. This is a war between the debtor class and the creditor class. And it's a war in which the authorities have sided with the creditor class. That is, they are going to preserve the banks. The banks in Germany are up to their eyeballs in lousy paper from Greece and Italy and Portugal and Spain. And the taxpayers, the debtor class, is getting squeezed. So that's another way, if you like class warfare, that's another way to look at it. The political way to look at it is he who pays the piper calls the tune, and Germany is going to call the tune. Now, she's got a real problem because they don't want to seem to be doing that, and they're bad at it. The person they picked to be the auditor of Greece to see if they're ready for the next tranche, the first time for the second tranche, was a German. So the poor guy shows up at the ministry in Athens, the finance ministry, and he is reminded that the Germans stole all their gold during World War II, and why doesn't he bring it back, and the problem would be over. So they've gotten a little smarter now. They use the IMF and intermediary institutions. But I think that's the best guess as to what's going to happen. I think they will become more dirigiste. They will have some labor market reforms along the way because the bond vigilantes won't tolerate a continuation of some of these ridiculous practices. But, the interesting, there are 3 presidents of the EU. They have 3 different types, but they're all presidents. And they're now having a battle over who gets to accept the Peace Prize. Which president? So, they can't agree on, it's a very dysfunctional government system, which will get more functional when they fiscally consolidate and when tax policy has to be cleared essentially with Berlin.
Does the EU survive?
Yeah, the EU will survive in a different form. The EU will survive if the 10 will be marginalized because the 17 will be making rules and the battle will be, do they apply? You go into a meeting of 27 people and you got 17 votes, you can do pretty much what you want. And I think the crunch is going to come when they put in new regulations for stock trading and bank regulation that will apply to Britain. Because Frankfurt and Paris have always wanted to undermine London as a financial center. And this will give them the opportunity to do that because they are against markets, whereas London is for it. So I think there'll be a brawl. There's certainly going to be a brawl in Britain. There's going to have to be a referendum sooner or later on whether Britain stays in. And right now, whether it stays in the EU, if that were held tomorrow, they'd get out. Now, once it starts, then people get reminded of the agriculture subsidies that they're getting and so on. And I don't know how it'll come out. But, David Cameron is under gigantic pressure from his party to hold a referendum on an in or out referendum. And he's trying to forestall that by saying we'll get the deal we made with them modified so that they no longer, for instance, can impose the Human Rights Act on Britain, which is causing all sorts of problems with immigration policy and so on. But that's how I think it's going to play out. I'm sorry it took so long, but I know too much about it. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on that. I read the Frankfurter Allgemeine
Yes.
in the morning, and I often, when I read the Europe articles, I read the comments from
Right.
the readers because, it's
Yeah.
interesting to see. And what I glean from that is the opposite of what you were saying, that Germany is calling the shots and that people feel guilty. And I mean, that's a particular readership, maybe because it's a more conservative paper, but the feeling is that, yeah, we're screwed. I mean, there's nothing, we are hostages of the other countries because
Why?
they're too big to fail and we have to bail them out.
Why?
They're readers of what's the name of the guy? Well, just that Germany would lose 800 billion or more if they actually decided, for instance, themselves to get out of the euro. That there's nothing, the people I talk to say there's nothing we can do. Everything would be worse than not paying up. But it's not because we're the ones that are calling the shots, but we are the ones that.
You're the victim, in other words.
I mean, I don't know if.
I mean, they feel they're
But
trapped.
right now you're in a position where you're not free to choose, but where everybody's bargaining that you can't do it.
That's not true, is all I can tell you. Do you read Joe Jaffe, by the way, who writes a very good column in one of the papers? Probably a down market paper from your point of view. Always read the tabloids. That tells you what's going on. The broadsheets don't really have any connection with reality in most countries.
But the readers' views.
Yeah, but look, the business community in Germany is dead set against going out because they know what would happen. If Greece goes out or the southern countries go out, or if Germany goes out, either way, there will be a revaluation of the currency up because this drag is gone or because Germany, right? That's going to really hurt the export industries, and that's what they're worried about. That's what they're worried about. But the notion that the banks will be in trouble, they've got on their books all this paper that's worth nothing.
Yeah.
And by recognizing that it's worth nothing, they will be in trouble. That's wrong. They have, now, again, you're reading the papers and I'm talking to people. It's obviously different samples. But the fact of the matter is that if Germany decides to let these people go, and Marty Feldstein had a very good plan. He said there should be a Euro South and a Euro North, let them for a while, and then reintegrate it at a different exchange rate so that the South would then be competitive. It's just like Germany with taking in where Kohl insisted that an Eastern German mark was equivalent to a West German mark and left you 10 years to get, it's still digging out of that nonsense. And economists tried to talk him out of that. And he sat in the room with George Schultz and others who said, you can't do it that way. And he looked at them and said, this has nothing to do with economics, and left the room. I think in a way he was right. But you may be right, I may be right, I don't know. I've laid out what I think is a plausible scenario based on plausible reasons. I could be wrong. I mean, that you should understand that. I mean, in case it has not yet occurred to you, I could be wrong on these issues. And this one is, you could be right, and you're more in touch with that polity than I am. So
I have a question. Well, okay, maybe I'll put it anyway. The reason I called you a politically savvy economist is that you understand that people act on questions of honor as well as of gain.
Right.
As your remark about the Jews in the companies that took over. Yeah, that question you faced, and also just now about coal and so on. But I was wondering, there seemed to be a kind of tension between your presentation and your answers to questions.
Yeah.
Your presentation is about a broad-minded nonpartisan view of each of the issues that you raised with advantages and disadvantages on either side, suggesting the necessity of compromise.
Right.
But when actually we have to face these questions, it turns out to be not so much a question of compromise, but of choice between them, or between fundamental differences. Because maybe it's the case that a perfect compromise is just as utopian as a perfect realization of each of the things that you're compromising. And
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah.
Well, I think there are two reasons for that distinction. My policy bent is the former. That is to look at the merits on both sides of the argument, to recognize that honorable men can disagree and that wise honorable men can compromise their disagreements. One of the problems we've had is that right now nobody's willing to compromise on anything. When the minority leader says my goal for the next 4 years is to make sure the president loses, I mean, that's a hell of a policy. And the president's, and they go to a meeting and the president, they present an argument to him and he says, look, we won. So I, in a longer paper I've done on some of these subjects, you'll see this terrible ambivalence I have between, but you have to go into a compromise argument situation knowing where you'd like to come out and try to come out as close to that as possible. One reason I'm mildly for Romney, although I'm much more than mildly against Obama, is because that's how he lived his life. You don't walk into the kind of business transactions he walked into and say, okay, 100 million, that's it. If you want 101, I'm gone. That's not what you do. You walk in and you try to figure out how you can give the other guy enough of what he needs to emerge with honor, as he would see it, intact, whereas you haven't given so much that you can emerge with honor. Obama doesn't understand that. His whole life was not that. Perhaps I should apologize for the more outrageous statements designed to provoke thought. And maybe that revealed the inner me, for all I know. But in the situations, the policy arguments I've been in, over nuclear plants, over lots of stuff, I've always felt that even with regulators, the other guy is honorable. He's got a thing that he believes in. And the question is, how close can you come to allowing him to emerge intact without surrendering too much? Now, that's the trouble is that that's not a lecture. I mean, that's a sentence.
It's also your side got the line, remember?
Well, that was punitive action. That had nothing to do with compromise. That was plain old getting even. And I'm for that sometimes, especially in those circumstances. You have no idea how intense that was. I mean, there were meetings called at investment banks asking the people who were doing the takeovers to stop because it would unleash a wave of anti-Semitism in America. I mean, it was unbelievable. I couldn't believe what I was living through. Because it was an anti-establishment assault by Aravists. I mean, that's what it was. They happened to be Jewish. That was unfortunate in terms of creating anti-Semitism. But it was an attack, an assault on the establishment and the way it did business by a bunch of Aravists. It was extraordinarily intense. So there, I think revenge is okay. In fact, if you look at Adam Smith, and he says, when he's talking about trade, and he says if somebody is discriminating against your trade, revenge is appropriate. He uses the word. So I'll hide behind that.
Well, thanks. We have to stop, but charm and humor together with your good sense.
Well, thank you
Just
very
wonderful.
much.